John Ashworth visited London during the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. The Great Exhibition was a celebration of modern industrial technology and design, which took place in Hyde Park from the 1st of May to the 15th of October 1851, and was organised by a man named Henry Cole and Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. It was the first in a series of World's Fairs exhibitions of culture and industry that became popular in the 19th century, and was a platform on which countries from around the world could display their achievements. 6 million people, the equivalent of a third of the entire population of Britain at the time, visited the Great Exhibition. During this visit to London, John Ashworth said, "No place produced so deep an impression on his mind as the home for the destitute there." He said, "I had seen its palaces of glass, brick and stone, visited its museums, galleries and other splendid places of attraction, also its prisons, penitentiaries, hospitals and houses of refuge. But the home for the destitute interested me more than all beside. What I saw and felt on visiting this place produced a degree of anguish from which I have never wholly recovered. Hardened villainy, misery, wretchedness and hopeless despair were evident on every side. All the woes of the apocalypse seemed to have overtaken the miserable inmates. I felt they were all my brothers and sisters, and I felt that sin had done it all." Mr. Ashworth felt it his duty to reach the outcasts of his hometown with the love of God, so on his return to Rochdale he made a vow that he would at once open a chapel for the destitute. He said, "If they will not come to us, then we must go to them, meet them on their own terms, and provide them with places of worship adapted to their own condition, in the spirit of love trying to gather in the outcast and tell them the tale of the cross." Mr. Ashworth consulted his friends, but the idea faced so much opposition and so many objections that he gave up on it. A period of 7 years passed, but during this time Mr. Ashworth was by no means idle. He continued to be diligent in business and fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. He continued as a Sunday school teacher, class leader and local preacher, but still felt there was some other special work which he was under a solemn obligation to do that had been left undone. In 1851, a lecturer and former American slave called Mr. Henry Box Brown announced a writing competition for the best essay on slavery, which should be composed by a Rochdale workman. John Ashworth's nephew, also named John Ashworth, encouraged him to enter an essay he'd composed entitled "The Horrors and Curse of Slavery," and Mr. Ashworth's piece won. As a prize, he received a handsome family Bible. John Ashworth's mother, Alice, died on the 4th of December 1851, at the age of 77. Alice Ashworth was buried at Bamford Chapel with her husband, John Ashworth's father. Mr. Ashworth often visited his parents' grave in the churchyard at Bamford. He considered it a very sacred spot indeed. It was most probably here where he was inspired to write his touching reflections about falling leaves, which appears at the start of his narrative, The Old Deacon. On the 11th of September 1853, the bull-baiting ringleader Nathaniel Kershaw, or Niff, heard about the love of God for sinners after John Ashworth invited him to an outdoor service on the Green, or Bagslake Common, in Cookgate. Mr. Ashworth said Niff was daily employed in the service of Satan, and formally encouraged bull-baiting and dog-fighting, and kept a number of fighting cocks and dogs for gambling purposes. He also had a powerful voice, and when drunk, his awful blaspheming could be heard over the whole village. Niff's house was near the Green, and this is where the infamous bull-baiting used to take place. When he heard the preaching whilst stood at his door, he was so intrigued that he drew nearer, first peeping and listening behind a holly bush, and then standing amongst the people and sitting down on a low fence to listen to the truth of God's word. Rochdale Golf Course was not constructed until 1888, and in the 1850s there were very few buildings in this vicinity other than the houses at the Green, and some houses behind some trees across the road, opposite some stone posts marked Green Mount, This is possibly the location of the green where the outdoor service took place. There is still a large holly bush beside the gate to one of the houses on the opposite side of the road, so it is very likely this is where Niff lived. Niff attended 3 religious services that day in 1853, 2 on the green and 1 at Bagslake Chapel, and a change came over him that was apparently so great the whole country was amazed by it. Afterwards, one woman described Niff as the worst man in the world mended. Mr. Ashworth called him the greatest wonder of God's mercy in all Lancashire, and said if the church steeple had fallen it would not have been more talked about. In 1853, when he was attending a meeting of the Peace Society in Edinburgh, John Ashworth met with John W. Barber and his daughter Elizabeth, 2 celebrated American writers who were at that time making a tour through Europe. A few weeks after they met, Miss Barber wrote to Mr. Ashworth saying, "You have no ordinary talent in writing. Who knows what time may yet bring for you with a cultivation of the heaven-born talent with which God has endowed you. Perhaps I shall yet see your name enrolled amongst English authors, and your productions always, I know, on the side of truth, justice and liberty." It was around this time that John Ashworth met an old woman near the end of School Lane in Rochdale, who introduced him to a little lad called Tommy Pollitt. 14-year-old Tommy was living in a dirty, miserable home at the Slopes near Broadfield, was lying on a bed of straw and was so sick, having hurt his spine by falling down the stairs several years before, he was almost a skeleton. The only clothing he had was a pair of trousers, which he had used for a pillow, but his mother had pawned them for drink. The poor, wasted, suffering little Tommy asked Mr. Ashworth to talk to him about Jesus Christ, which Mr. Ashworth said caused a thrill of joy to run through his soul. He said, "Of all my little ragged friends, there is none I have felt and still feel so much interest in as poor, feeble, affectionate Tommy Pollitt." Another of the young ragged friends Mr. Ashworth met at this time was Elizabeth, or Lizzie Johnson, a little girl who lived in a lodging house in Church Lane. Her mother was ill, and her stepfather was a drunkard. She asked John Ashworth to read and pray with her dying mother, and when her mother died he paid for her a second-hand black frock to wear at the funeral. On the day of the burial, hundreds of people stood still and watched as little Lizzie followed her mother through the Gate of Tears to her last resting place at Rochdale Cemetery. A kind-hearted woman was so affected she offered to take and adopt Lizzie for her own child. Mr. Ashworth said his heart was full of thankfulness that he who promises to take care of the helpless had provided such a home for this poor, motherless and worse than fatherless child. Mr. Ashworth often read with and prayed with the prisoners at the jail on Rope Street. He described the prison when he was speaking to some young boys there who were locked up awaiting trial for stealing, saying, "On opening the strong doors and iron gate, we ascended the steps leading to the various cells, and on drawing the slides of each cell door, that I might see and speak with the inmates of those dismal abodes of penal suffering, a thin streak of light from a small high-grated window enabled me to recognise several of my other young friends." During the 1854 Whitsuntide procession, hundreds of people gathered outside the home of a teacher called Miss Anne Hoyle Marsden at a house called Harelands in the area of Larkfield, near Rochdale train station. Anne's mother had died when she was young, and she was dying of consumption. She was carried downstairs and placed in an easy chair before the drawing-room window so she could see the procession. While all her friends were round her weeping, John Ashworth said 24-year-old Anne was calmly smiling and asked them to sing a hymn. "From every sin and sorrow free, I shall the King of glory see. All is well." Anne died a few days later. She was buried at St. Chad's on the 19th of June, 1854. In Cutgate there is a row of cottages opposite the old toll house on Edenfield Road, called Percival Houses. One of these cottages was the home of a woolen weaver named Adam Schofield. Old Adam was a self-righteous individual, but John Ashworth shared stories of conversion with him and gave him a little book called Come to Jesus, and he became a sinner saved by grace and a very happy child of God. He said, "When I saw myself, what I was and what I had been, on the day I obtained mercy, I believed and felt that if my sins of heart and life had been spread out, they were enough to damn all the people in Rochdale." Afterwards, with childlike simplicity, old Adam spoke of his entire dependence on Christ as the only foundation of his hope. Adam Schofield was 86 years old when he died. He was buried at St Clement's Church in Scotland on the 5th of December 1857.